Hello and welcome. Sorry for the brief technical delay. And welcome to episode 2 of Modern Western Buddhism. Today I'm planning on discussing essentially the opening of these notes that I prepared for the course. And the big idea, so to speak, is to really give you a... there we are. I don't know why that keeps happening. So the big idea is today just to give you an overview of what is meditation, and to, in that regard, also give you sort of a non-sectarian, non-denominational introduction to what meditation is in sort of a wider historical context. And then also to briefly discuss with you the nature of consciousness in Buddhism. So 3 very, very important topics. And I'm going to do my best. So here we go. So there we are. So first, let's begin just by talking a bit about sort of the proper introduction to what it is I'd like to take you through in general, if you decide to carry forward with the course, or even if you're just dropping in. So this text that we're going to be working from is originally Venerable Kamalashila's stages of well, depends on if you're using the regular language or if you're using the Sanskrit translation, but stages of meditation, the Bhavana Krama, right? So this text has 3 different, very large portions to it, written at different times. The most important detail to think about and remember is, again, this is a monastic who's writing for other monastics who very likely will be going into some type of extended retreat in order to gain samadhi, in order to gain a state of single-pointed concentration. So in addition to that, I'm going to be using, sort of as the basis of the discussion, the Lamrim Chenmo, which is Venerable Tsongkhapa's sort of magnum opus on meditation and mental training in general, listing the entire path from a Buddhist perspective, from starting on day 1 all the way through to full awakening, full enlightenment, as far as Buddhism is concerned. It is an astonishing work of religion, philosophy, and psychology. Absolutely astonishing work. Now, I've also selected numerous commentators who lived in the last 200 years to really help bring some of the language into the modern day. And in particular, I'd like to point out Yangtze Rinpoche's Practicing the Path, which is an excellent, excellent modern way of describing and talking about all of the Lamrim issues that Venerable Tsongkhapa, or J. Tsongkhapa, I think I'll call him, is discussing in his larger text. Pabongka Rinpoche is an important lineage for me personally. Pabongka Rinpoche taught Trijang Rinpoche. Trijang Rinpoche taught Tharchin Rinpoche. Tharchin Rinpoche taught Mr. Kimball Whitfield, my main mentor, who taught me. And so there's a direct lineage of transmission of Pabongka Rinpoche's teachings coming through Trijang Rinpoche's personal notes, having attended those teachings, to Venerable Tharchin Rinpoche, who took those notes that were written down in Tibetan and translated them into English, through to my own teacher, who received many of Pabongka Rinpoche's teachings in English from Tharchin Rinpoche. So I do rely a bit heavily, I would say, on Pabongka Rinpoche's teachings for that reason. They really strike me personally, I think because of being directly in that lineage, and because he's so close. He's only a couple of Dharma generations back. Finally, I've also used numerous Pali Suttas and Theravadan commentaries, In particular, at least in terms of reference, I've referenced the two major Theravada commentaries from the Pali tradition, the Path of Purification, and the other one is another purification name that I'm forgetting. In any case, one is 2nd century, the other is 4th or 5th century. So these are very, very early Pali sources, which therefore are going to be closer in theory, right, to what the Buddha originally said. But that's a whole other can of worms we can get into on a different day. By and large, also, throughout the text, we are going to be seeing a bit of influence from Zen and Chen Buddhism, as well as seeing a bit of influence from here and there, a bit of Taoism, simply because I have some background in that. And frankly, at some point, I think I'm going to invite a Taoist priest on the program to discuss those issues who's much more versed than I am in these things. But frankly, the history of Buddhism and Taoism, in particular in China, is so close. I mean, quite literally, in numerous cases, they inhabited the same monastery, and they all called themselves Buddhist at various times because the emperors wanted to kill all the Taoists, or they all called themselves Taoists at various times because the emperor wanted to kill all the Buddhists. And so the exchange of meditative technology between Taoism and Buddhism in China is profound. And because of that, there are Buddhist monks all throughout the history of China who hold lineages in both Taoism and Buddhism. And we'll discuss that more as we go. So there is limited information in this document from the Taoist tradition. But again, I wanted to keep the core essence, in particular, of Je Tsongkhapa's presentation of Venerable Kamalashila's stages of meditation intact. So everything else is therefore supplementary. It should also be noted that Venerable Tsongkhapa is an astonishing scholar, absolutely astonishing scholar. So his work references sutras and commentaries spanning basically the entirety of Buddhist history. If it is one of the great texts, it probably has been referenced to produce his presentation of training the mind in meditation. And so you can see the list here. If anyone would like the notes for this course, please get in contact with me either on Facebook or through Patreon or through YouTube, and I can get you the notes for the course so that you can follow along as we go and get a lot more detail than I'm going to give verbally here. So on the first episode, I already discussed my mentor. I already discussed a bit about myself, so I don't want to cover that ground again. On non-sectarianism, I'd like to give a brief presentation of this before we talk about meditation proper. And then I'm going to skip ahead just a bit, and we're going to talk about the definition of meditation in the Buddhist tradition. And then we're going to go back, and we're going to talk about the mind, because without understanding what the mind is in Buddhism, you're going to have so many problems really understanding what the whole endeavor is about in terms of training and meditation. So without further ado, let us proceed. So it should be noted, as I noted in the previous episode, that this will not be sort of the secular presentation of Buddhism that has become so popular in the West. I do not plan to throw out Buddhism when I present Buddhism. I want to present Buddhism in its full form as the living practitioners of Buddhism around the world today discuss the tradition in full detail without pulling any punches. And it's taken me quite a long time to become settled about all of these details myself. It's taken me quite a long time to be settled about some of the things that sound a bit more out there in Buddhism. And so in the course of these discussions, I hope that if I say things that sound out there or sound nutty, that you will, to a degree, take it on faith. That If you ask me an explanation for any one of these details that seems out there, that seems unspeakably weird and Buddhist and disconnected from all the things we think are true generally as modern Western people, that there is quite a good explanation for why I hold that view. And that explanation, by and large, will not simply be a Buddhist one. There's a tremendous amount of good reasoning beyond the Buddhist tradition that justify some of these positions. For example, having to do with the nature of consciousness and having to do with things like karma. But we will discuss those another day. That being said, without further ado, once again, why in general should we be non-sectarian in Buddhism? In general, if you start at not day one, but day two of the Lamrim, and you start looking at the teachings on, well, how did you end up as a human being? How did you end up here in this time as a human being with access to libraries full of the Buddha's words and later additions in terms of commentary on those words of great living practitioners who realize the meaning of those words in their own minds? How did you end up here? Well, you weren't Buddhist. This is an extremely important point. You didn't get here by being Buddhist. Maybe some of us did, a few. But by and large, we got here through training in non-Buddhist dharmas. By and large, we got here by training in things that were not Buddhism. We got here through ethics. We got here through good character. We got here through generosity. We didn't arrive here because we were extraordinary Buddhist practitioners in the past, by and large. So let's just discuss these things a little bit more in detail. My main mentor used to say the karma associated with meeting the Buddha Dharma in this life as a human being with the capacity to actually engage in Dharma practice is your best karma, maybe lifetimes of previous karma, of being of service to others at a profound level, self-sacrificing, altruistic, loving and kind in all of the ordinary sort of senses in which you can be so. And therefore, one has to say as a Buddhist, since you weren't Buddhist to get here and become Buddhist, automatically you have to have respect for non-Buddhist traditions, non-Buddhist dharmas. Automatically you have to have respect for those who are genuinely striving under any system to be ethical, generous, patient, kind, humble, loving, compassionate, to get their own nonsense out of the way and try to live for some higher meaning and purpose. You have to have some respect for that activity. In fact, you have to have profound respect for it because that is in a continuum, according to Buddhist training and Buddhist sources, with the training that you're involved with now, if you're Buddhist. Now, this gets even more complicated, right? Because that's kind of the basic model. Like, we're already at the end of the path here, and everyone else just needs to catch up. But frankly, when you look at the details of, for example, the Jataka tales of the Buddha's previous lives, he spent so much time practicing non-Buddhist traditions. As a bodhisattva, he spent so much time being reborn as all sorts of things that weren't human beings and doing little things here and there and here and there that advanced his training, even as animals and so on, according to the Buddhist tradition. And so the model then becomes even more convoluted, right? This model of, well, how did you end up here? What does it mean to be Buddhist? What does it mean to be involved in a continuum of mental training? Becomes more complicated, much more complicated. One of my teachers I won't say who because I don't plan to mention anyone who didn't explicitly say, please tell other people this or tell other people I said this. But one of my teachers said that there was a highly realized meditator in one of the Gelik monasteries, and this is recent. And that meditator was missing a friend of his, and he didn't know where that friend had ended up, who was also an accomplished meditator. And so he used his clairvoyance to locate the mental continuum of that other person. And it turned out that that person had already been reborn somewhere, and they were teaching Hinduism as a Swami. And so, of course, being a good Buddhist, he was quite confused. How could you go from teaching Anatman to teaching Atman again? So he seeks out this teacher, and he goes and he finds him, and he says, what are you doing? And the answer was quite simple. It's of more benefit to others right now to be this Hindu teacher. This is what I'm doing. I'm teaching this as a Hindu. Okay, so now we have a model where great Buddhist meditators are reborn sometimes as the leaders of non-Buddhist traditions because it's of greater benefit. So now you have to say, well, is it conceivable on a Buddhist understanding of bodhisattvas and multiple rebirths and beings of higher realization? Within that model, is it conceivable that some bodhisattvas take rebirth into non-Buddhist systems of practice that have all the other pieces there except for the emptiness piece, except for the piece that gives you ultimate liberation or ultimate enlightenment, and they provide that piece to that system? Is that inconceivable? I don't think so. I think that's entirely conceivable. Not only that, I just provided an example where that's quite plausibly what's going on. And if not that they're providing a system wherein those training in that system with earnestness will be reborn in a circumstance where they encounter this information. I think, again, if you're deeply convinced that Buddhism is the best way, the only way, the final way, and all this, you also have to accept that this sort of thing is going on. And so therefore, there must be streams of non-Buddhist training, practice, psychology, etc., that are in the same continuum as the, for lack of a better term, the final results of the training that we're supposedly we are involved in now, insofar as we are involved. Also, if you want an argument from authority on the Buddhist side, His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says, and I'm paraphrasing, do not try to use what you learn from Buddhism to be a Buddhist. Use it to be a better whatever you already are. Christian, Hindu, Muslim, doesn't matter. So the Dalai Lama has extensively spoken about the respect that he has for other traditions. He has actively supported, in some cases, the spread and promotion of other religions. And I think if we understand it in this way that I just spoke of, then it makes perfect sense. These are streams of teachings that are in the same stream as the one that we're standing in, the stream that we're trying to cross, for lack of a better term. Indeed, also, I can make a historical argument, and I think for modern Western people, this is maybe the most profound. Even if you have faith in His Holiness the Dalai Lama, even if you have faith in the oral tradition, for example, that I just relayed from one of my teachers, that there are great bodhisattvas doing these kinds of things, there's also a historical argument to be made here. And I'm going to talk in particular about Taoism because I think this is perhaps the most profound example of this. So let me transition back to my document. So, as with the Bon tradition in Tibet, there is extensive historical cross-pollination between Taoism and Buddhism in China in particular. And that goes for Chan Buddhism, it goes for Chinese Buddhist Tantra, etc. The reason for this is quite simple. Again, there have been vast periods of Chinese history where at one time the emperor didn't like this group and he liked that group. And so the Buddhists said, yeah, come hang up, come hang with us. And when the emperor is no longer angry at you, then you can go on your way. But as it so happened, this has happened so many times in Chinese history that in some regards, these traditions have really come together to form one thing in some streams. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. For example, Venerable Louis Huayang, 1736, was a Chan monk and is a lineage holder in both the Longmen, the Dragon Gate school, and and that's part of the Complete Reality lineage. So the Complete Reality lineage is the largest school of Taoism that still exists today. It has the most adherents, and he wrote a text called the Hui Ming Jing. And I apologize if there's any Chinese speakers on the stream or in the future if they watch this, because I don't speak either Cantonese or Mandarin. So this one text, the Hui Ming, integrates his Chan teachings as a Chan Buddhist monk and his Complete Reality lineages that he had inherited through the Dragon Gate school of Taoism into one comprehensive system of mind training. And I bring up this example because it's recent, because it's a Chan monk who is a recognized Chan monk and holder of a lineage of Chan Buddhism, who was also had the complete lineage of this particular Taoist school. And he wrote a text saying, here's how they relate to each other. If you look quite closely at Chan history and Chinese Buddhist history, you'll see that there is text after text after text where these two traditions are coming together and forming one master tradition. I think quite notably, one that everyone is going to be quite aware of is the Shaolin Temple, for example, right? So you may be thinking, oh yes, but the Taoists, they have this weird Tao thing, and they're doing a lot of types of practices and things that we're not doing as Buddhists. Well, I mean, to a degree that's true, to a degree it's not true. And it depends on what stream of Taoism you're talking about. But for example, many Taoist lineages include a practice called Zuowang, sitting and forgetting. And if you understand this technique properly, it is so close to Mahamudra, Bon Dzogchen, Chan, and Zen that if I were to take the name off of some of these texts and writings, change the terminology just slightly so that it doesn't sound so Taoist-y, it just sounds a tiny bit more Buddhist-y, you couldn't tell which one was which. If I made the language slightly more neutral, there are huge passages in these texts where you couldn't tell which one's which. And the reason is because they were staying at the same monasteries doing the same practices. And after hundreds of years of doing this, they're being taught in an extremely similar way in Buddhist and Taoist lineages this particular technique, which is just sitting. It is shikantaza. It's a technique that's actually found not just in Buddhism, it's found in Hinduism. You find it really all over the place. In any case, these sorts of interminglings and so on, they go on and on. You find lots of Taoist stuff being talked about by the major founders of Zen Buddhism. And even though Dogen and Hakuan Ikkeku, not founder, but the great reviver of Rinzai, both of these important Buddhist leaders of Japan, even though they do make statements where they deride to a degree the Taoist teachings or the Confucian teachings and so on, and basically say, yes, but we have the final thing, and these guys are kind of screwing it up over here. Even though that is said by both Dogen and Hakuan Zenji, if you read their teachings, they quote and reference the Tao Te Ching, and they reference Confucian teachings, and they often do this all the time without mentioning where the teachings came from. And this is because this was part of the culture at the time, right? If you were born in Japan and raised in these circumstances, I spoke about this last time, so I don't want to go on and on about it, but there are good reasons why these things exist in the way that they do, being so intermingled. It's that when Buddhism encounters a new culture, it adjusts itself and changes a bit and maintains the core tradition, adds some practices, removes some practices, adds some ways of explaining that weren't there because that's how the culture thinks about things now, gets rid of some things or stops talking about certain things that aren't how the culture talks about them anymore, and the core, the essence, carries on, right? For the Madhyamaka Prasankas in the room, this is your disclaimer that when I say essence, I don't mean inherent existence. Okay, so there are quite a few modern examples where, and I'm just going to give two quite quickly because I don't want to belabor this point about non-sectarianism, but there are two quite prominent Taoist teachers in the Western world who were also trained extensively in Tibetan Tantra. Liu Ming is one. His real name is Charles Bea. He died quite recently, as you can see. He died in 2015, but he was an extremely influential Euro-American Taoist lineage holder, and had also spent, I think, 25 years in Tibetan Tantra. So it doesn't really get any more authentic than that. It's not like he didn't understand the Buddhist side of this, and so therefore he fell into some weird Taoist hole and he couldn't get out. He understood the Buddhist side of this about as well as you can, and he did those practices at the highest level for a long time. And he found some other aspect of training that was more advantageous for him and his students in the Taoist tradition. And that shouldn't be controversial because these traditions have histories that are like this. And they share techniques, they share all sorts of technology. In particular, when you start talking about Taoist alchemy and tantric technologies, they are hand in glove. The Taoist technologies, as well as the Bon technologies, and I'm not an expert on this, but from what I've read, the Bon technologies and the Taoist technologies are extremely similar. And I spoke with a Taoist priest who's a good friend of mine, and he actually trained in Bon for 5 years or 7 years in addition to his Taoist training, and he said it's the same. He said that basically what you do in the Bon and the Taoist traditions is you start with certain types of energetic training, elemental training at the level of the body. And this type of training is not wishy-washy in any way. It's about as subtle as a sledgehammer if you're doing it properly. It's in no way subtle such that you could fake yourself out about doing it or not doing it. If you can manipulate these energies in the body, it is extremely profound. What it does to your mind and your body you can really hurt yourself actually if you can do these practices. If you do them improperly, you can literally bake your organs inside your body. So in any case, be quite careful if you jump into energetic practices having to do with the body, and make sure you find good teachers. That being said, this type of training, this type of internal alchemy training where you're working with energies at the level of the body, is something that they also do at the Shaolin Temple. So there are Buddhist versions of these exact same exercises. And according to a scholar in particular that I trust in this issue, he says that if you know both the Taoist versions and the Shaolin versions, and you're aware of all the writings on both sides, they're the same. They are the exact same practices whether you're a Buddhist or you're a Taoist, and you're working at the level of the body. The Taoists also have the subtler versions of these technologies where you're not working at the level of the body, physical body. You're working at the level of a subtler body in which energies also move. But that's a much bigger can of worms, maybe left for another day. In any case, once again, these technologies are shared in common, and many of the results that practitioners experience, even at an extremely high level, are the same. And when I've spoken with people on the Buddhist side who have trained in both, and people on the Taoist side who have trained in both, they say it's the same. And people on the Hindu side, by the way, also same. So one of my favorite phrases from Western philosophy is, a difference to be a difference must make a difference. In terms of these internal energy technologies, this is a place where the difference doesn't make a difference. In terms of training in concentration, this is a place where the difference doesn't make a difference. In terms of even some of the higher types of training in meditation, like Zhuowang, Dzogchen, Mahamudra, Shikantaza, these techniques where you simply sit and try to stop the mind from engaging in a lot of its ordinary activity and look at the mind as the primary basis of your meditative training, is a place where the difference doesn't seem to make much difference. There are a couple different angles of attack for that type of training, but if you read these texts carefully, and in particular if you talk to the practitioners of these techniques, and in particular if you talk to them in the West, where major teachers have already blended these traditions because they trained in the Tibetan stuff and they trained in the Taoist stuff, right? This is a place where the difference doesn't really make a difference. The second example I'm only going to mention briefly is internal martial artist. Where did he go? Oh yes, B.K. Francis. So B.K. Francis is quite well known for his Wu style Tai Chi, his Yang style Tai Chi, his Bagua, his Xingyi, but he's also a Taoist lineage holder. He's also trained in Tibetan Tantra. He's also trained in Kundalini in the Hindu traditions, in at least one Hindu tradition for 2 years. So he has an extensive meditative background. And his teacher, one of his main teachers, if I'm not mistaken, for Bagua, took up Taoist alchemy after having already been labeled a living Buddha in the Chinese Tantric tradition, in the Tiantai tradition. So, once again, I think as a Buddhist, some of us may be caught off guard by these kinds of things, because there's quite a bit of sectarian in Buddhism, despite what you may have heard. And we think, how is it possible that someone who's already considered a living Buddha could go train in Taoism? What's going on with this? Well, it's because these techniques are shared in common between these traditions. And because really the only question is there some endpoint difference that makes a difference between the two? And for me, this is where I think I'm going to make the argument in general, that I think that this is probably where there is the major difference, right? Even if you go back to the Pali Canon, right? Even if you go back to the Pali Canon, what you find is basically that, how do I say? Let me hop back over and talk to you on video here. So even in the Pali sources, you find quite striking statements by the Buddha, for example, where he got very close to not teaching, right? He sat under the Bodhi tree, he attained enlightenment, he goes through this series of visions at the final moments of his of his enlightenment process, and he sits there afterwards and he thinks, or reasons, or simply knows that this information is so difficult. I don't think anyone will get this. And he almost doesn't teach. Gets very close to not teaching. And according to the Buddhist sources, the highest god of the Hindu canon appears to him and says, teach. There are people around who have just a speck of dust in their eye, just a speck of dust, right? That literally you should be able to go like this and they'll get it and they'll be out, they'll be done. Now, if you take that literally, it maybe sounds a bit, maybe a bit political, right? The founder of our tradition had your highest God appear to him, bow down, and ask him to teach. So, I mean, that is a bit funny if you have a sense of humor. But if we're taking this allegorically rather than literally, the highest realization, according to modern Hindu adepts of various streams, but let's take the Advaita Vedanta position, also echoed somewhat in people like Eckhart Tolle. You find a bit of that sort of flavor. And certainly there are numerous strains of these interpretations, so I hope, once again, that no one's offended that I'm only sort of picking out the major one, right? But if we look at, well, what is the final thing? What is the final realization? The final thing, the final realization is Sat Chit Ananda, right? Knowing, consciousness, bliss. Knowing, consciousness, bliss is the final state of realization. Now, there are certain streams of Hindu teachings and Vedanta teachings where they say, well, actually, the consciousness part can go. Oh, no, I got it wrong. Sorry. Sat, being, absolute being. Sat, Chit, mind, Ananda, bliss. So absolute being, mind or knowingness, cognizance, and bliss. Now, this should sound familiar if you've been trained in something like Mahamudra, Dzogchen, right? This should sound quite familiar. The only thing that's different is emptiness, knowingness, and bliss, or simply emptiness bliss, which includes the knowingness, or emptiness awareness. So really, if you look at what modern Advaita Vedanta practitioners and various strains actually of sort of Neo-Vedanta, what they're saying is that the final state is you get to a state of awareness in deep, deep, deep samadhi, where all that's left is an absolute sense that there is a knowingness that is real, and that being is real, and there is the knowingness itself, and there is the intense bliss of that state, and that's it. And what the Buddhist meditators are saying is, well, actually, if you look quite close at that beingness element, if you look quite close at the absolute existence element, you can't find it. And so the Gelug Geshes would say, the Gelug scholars would say, actually, if you get to the point where the mind is so subtle that that's all that's left, which from a Buddhist perspective would mean that you're getting into the very, very subtle samadhis. You're getting into the formless samadhis. I think they draw the line at the fourth form level for those who are more familiar with these things. That from the fourth form level and up, you don't have enough discrimination, i.e. you don't have enough sort of subtle conceptual thoughts still remaining in the mind to do the analysis that's required to get rid of this beingness, this absolute existence sort of appearance that occurs in much deeper states of meditation. And so you actually need to go back a bit in your meditative training and address this at the level of meditative concentration where you can still generate conception at a subtle level. And if you don't do that, then you can't get rid of the problem. In any case, there is somewhere in the Pali Canon, and I wish I could find it, but I found it like 15 years ago and I haven't been able to find it again, but it is there. Maybe someone will put it in the comments, where the Buddha says, basically, if you look at the upper samadhis, It's like a vessel that's completely full with water, brimming. And you know how they say in the Pali Canon, they'll use like 10 descriptors for how brimming it is. It's right at the edge. It's almost falling over, blah, 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 right? So he says, Venerable monks, if you were to tip it to the east, would it spill immediately? If you tipped it to the west, would it spill immediately? Blah, blah, blah. And everyone says, yes, of course it would, Lord. Of course it would, teacher. And he said, so in the same way, someone who has these upper samadhis, if you just tip it slightly in the direction of selflessness, right? If you just input the correct information, the correct discernment, realization happens immediately. Because the mind is already so subtle, the mind is already so disciplined, the mind is already capable of just, with a slight push, gaining the final realization. So, from a Buddhist perspective, I would say this is the difference that makes a difference, right? What Buddhism really added to the playing field was this emptiness teaching, this selflessness teaching. And of course, there are numerous differences when you get into all the details of all of these traditions. I mean, the differences are infinite. But the ones that really, really make a difference, I think, is the emptiness component. Because you find analytical meditations in other traditions. You find samadhis in basically every mystical tradition on earth, from obviously Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, but not spoken of in those words. You find it in mystical Christianity. You find it in Christian contemplative or Christian mystical traditions. You find it in Western Hermetic traditions, Western mystery traditions, and even in Kabbalah. You find it in mystical Islam as well, right? If you're reading for that type of mental state and you know what the qualities of it are, and you read these texts and you look at the training techniques, you'll find practitioners describing that result. Which means, as Buddhists, we've sort of painted ourselves into the corner, right? Where we're saying, oh no, especially if you're of the sectarian kind of mind, where you want Buddhism to be like ultra special and super different from everything else. And it is, in a number of regards. In terms of how we arrange the information and the precision of the information in certain regards, absolutely, it's different. But where are the differences that make a difference? If one needs the right type of ethics and the right type of character, right? The right type of character traits, patience, perseverance, humility, contentment, in order to generate a meditative state. And these other traditions are gaining meditative states, then you have to admit, as a Buddhist, right? This is where the Gelug clap their hands, right? They go, you have to admit, as a Buddhist, that these other traditions must have the same common basis of stuff that you need to generate this other state. This state is an effect, in part an effect of having proper ethics and character. So if they have the state, they must have proper ethics and character. So then where's the difference that makes a difference? Selflessness, emptiness, and so on. So this is my long-winded justification for including some non-canonical information, some non-Buddhist meditative information in this presentation. Although in that regard, it's extremely limited, because I think, as a Buddhist, obviously I wouldn't be Buddhist if I didn't think it was the best way to do this. And if I didn't think the Buddhist presentation was the most precise, the most helpful, and so on, I would be something else. But I'm not. So, let's continue on. So, definitions. I'm going to switch back over. Give me a moment. So, definition. Let's talk about the mind first, and then we'll jump to the definition of meditation, because that's actually a little bit easier, I think. So, mind in Buddhism, if you've read some things, you may already be looking at this and saying, hey, there's There's an extra descriptor in there, or maybe even 2 extra descriptors in there. But I'm going to explain that in the course of time. So if you read the Pali Canon, you can find at least the description of knowing and clear. If you read numerous Tibetan sources, you can also find knowing and clear. Although sometimes mind is described as luminous, radiant, and my mentor, when he taught the aspects of mind, he always included luminous, even though it's not in the majority of sources. And he did this to really draw out one particular aspect of mind that very often is not talked about in as much detail as you might like. And so I presented that way also. Also, the term that's quite often translated as radiant or luminous is osel. But really, if you dive down into this term osel, it means clear and light. And so what are you talking about? Well, you're talking about clarity and knowing again, right? But it has this implication of light, and a light that is clear, like the light that's coming in through the window, right? It's white light, but it's completely clear. And so sometimes this is luminous or radiance, and it's quite helpful to talk about this as its own way of discussing a distinct property of mind. So the basic definition, that which is clear, knowing, and luminous. Short explanation. So in Buddhism, the mind is considered to be a sensory organ, in the same way that you have these 5 sensory organs, right? You also have a mental sensory organ, according to the Buddhist tradition. And how is that justified? Well, for example, if you're following along, take a moment and just visualize an apple in front of you, right? Visualize this apple with a red body, a brown stem, and a single green leaf. Is that apple being seen with your eyes? No. Your nose? No. Your ears? No. Your tongue? No. It's not. You're not touching it with your skin. So there's another organ that's being used to cognize this apple. Arguably, from a Western perspective, that organ is your brain. And all gross levels of consciousness have correlates in your physical brain, right? However, from a Buddhist perspective, the brain cannot be the originating place for consciousness for numerous reasons that, if some people are interested, we can go into in great detail. I actually have voluminous notes on this topic that go well beyond sort of the standard Buddhist presentation. Because this is one of those points that if you think the mind is a physical thing, it's going to be quite difficult to get the rest of Buddhism. Mind must be considered non-physical to really start to get at the essence of practically every topic of significance in Buddhism. So, the mind is the 6th sensory organ, which is where that terrible thing, the 6th sense, comes from. It's absolutely terrible. Sort of westernized understanding of this issue. So, longer explanation. As I said, there are numerous terms of interest when you're studying what is the mind, what is the nature of mind, what are its properties, and so on. And so we have to be quite careful. I don't want to misrepresent the meaning of these terms. In particular, the Tibetan terms that I've selected, Selshing, Rigpa, Osel. If you do wider reading, you're going to find that these terms have huge employment in certain contexts that differ from one another. And so I've used these terms only in the most general sense of their definitions. And I've used them here because I want to introduce them to you as the audience. In particular, if you've only been doing this for 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, and maybe you haven't encountered these terms. So if you do wider reading, you're going to see them used in different contexts, in different ways, with different meanings, and all of that's okay. But I'd like to just earmark them mentally for you now, because they're good terms. So the first one is clear. What does clear mean? Clear means that when you look at the mind, it has no findable material properties. It has no color, no shape, no size, no location in space, no mass, no velocity. It doesn't have a sound, a smell, a taste, or any kind of obstructive contact with which you could feel a tactile sensation. It shares no properties in common with the ordinary objects of the physical world, despite having correlates in the brain when gross levels of mind are operating and quite busy doing things like seeing stuff and hearing things and visualizing apples, and even doing tantric meditations, etc. We have good data for this now. So from a Buddhist perspective, the mind itself, in terms of this property of clarity, is formless. When you hear that the mind is space-like, this is what's being talked about. And the type of space is not space-time. It is a Buddhist philosophical concept called non-composed space or uncomposed space, which is, for lack of a better term, sort of the space into which space-time erupts or occurs, right? Non-composed space is simply non-obstructive contact, right? Or rather, the lack of obstructive contact. The mere fact that there isn't something stopping my hand moving from point A to point B. Space-time is deeply interacting with my hand moving from point A to point B, and so arguably space-time is what we would call composed space. It is a space made up of physical stuff, or space between physical stuff. Non-composed space is simply a mere lack of other phenomenon, a mere lack and openness that allows other things to occur in it. That is all. In the same way, mind has no physical properties, and this will come in the knowing section, so I'll leave that for now. You'll hear the term space-like, you'll hear the term spacious in some texts, and this is what's being talked about. We could go quite deeper, quite a bit deeper, and say also that mind's lack of obstructive elements can also go to its empty nature. But that's probably much too much detail for a short discussion on what the mind is. And since we're talking about calm abiding, we're talking about samadhi, where we don't need to go that deep. So in terms of knowing, rigpa, knowing is the subjective part of subject and object. If you read Gelug texts coming from the Nalanda tradition, they'll say that minds are object possessors, right? A mind is something that takes an object or in which an aspect of an object appears. So, for example, when you look at this screen, a light comes from the screen, it contacts the receptors in your eyeball, that creates something in your brain, right? A flurry of electrical activity. That electrical activity is somehow related to the image that occurs in your mind, and that is the aspect. The mental representation is an aspect of what has occurred externally. So that mental representation is actually what you're seeing. You're not seeing me on the screen, you're seeing the mental representation. So your environment is basically a hologram of mental representations. And there's some really wonderful neurology and sort of cognitive science stuff on this fact. What we're seeing are these representations. We're not seeing the world itself. They are causally related to the stuff that's out there. But the representations are aspects, and they are aspects that are tied up with needs and circumstances according to language, culture, history, biology, tied in with basically what it is you need to get out of the environment and hope to get out of the environment. So they're not some sort of ultimate reflection of what's going on out there. Also quite a deep topic. So there's also quite helpful language. I think this comes from Chalmers. Mind is a like-somethingness in the occurrence of reality. What does that mean? When two rocks bump into each other in a river, it's not like something for either rock to have bumped into the other one. It's just something that occurred. But when your mind, for lack of a better term, bumps into something, it's like something to have bumped into it. And so this fact that for our minds, for the minds that occur in this particular stream, it's like something when I bump into a rock, is the mental component, the knowing component. Finally, we have luminous, and this is quite an important concept. The Tibetan term that I've selected is osul, because it is occasionally translated as luminous or radiant. But as I already said, I think this is, again, because it's simply clear and light. But my teacher sometimes would talk about this as its own property, and it's helpful to do so, like I said. So basically, this is the fact that mind gives rise to these representations. Mind doesn't simply light up what's out there. Mind gives rise to a representation and interacts with the external world through the representation of the world, right? So we are just swimming in these representations. We are swimming in the luminous aspect of mind constantly. What you're experiencing is the luminosity of mind, is this generative, creative property of mind that it gives rise to things. Now, of course, this also includes, if you visualize the apple again, apple, red, brown stem, green leaf, it gives rise to the image, and then it knows the image, and it's like something to know the image. So these all have to do with the luminous property of mind. Now, in brief, I'm also going to discuss this term citta because it's quite important. So, in the aggregates model of Buddhism, there are 5 things that make up a person. The first one is rupa, right? The first one is rupa, or form. And this is, at its core, material things. It is particles. It is forces in the universe at large. It also includes the bodies of beings who don't have physical bodies at the level that we're experiencing a physical body. For example, desire realm gods have forms, but they're not made up of strong force, weak force, and so on. They're made up of essentially almost like the images that you generate mentally, right? When you visualize an apple, that apple is quite strange from a physics perspective. But we'll discuss that when we talk about mind in more depth. In any case, it's more like that. They visualize a body, practically speaking, and that form is what they see themselves in. They don't see themselves in a physical body like this that's so messy. Phenomenologically speaking, from a Buddhist perspective, form is made up of 4 elements, sometimes also 6 elements. Basically, from the perspective of perception, there is solid stuff, right? There are solid things, there are liquid things, there are gaseous things or vacuities like space, empty spaces. And there's also heat, which encompasses both heat and cold. Cold is simply the absence of the heat. So from the point of phenomenology, in terms of what appears to the mind while we're interacting with our own experience, there are these 4 sort of fundamental categories of stuff, right? So this model is quite important in early Buddhism and all the way up to today through to Tantric Buddhism. Also important for Taoism and Bon. The other 2 elements, of course, are space and consciousness. And that's something that both the Pali Canon and the later Buddhist traditions and Nagarjuna, Venerable Nagarjuna, I should say, agree upon. So then what is this citta side? What is the mental aggregate or the mental element? Well, in the sort of aggregate model, they break it down into 4 components. So Vedana, sensory perception and feeling. This is an interesting one. So we don't mean feeling in the sense that you have a feeling that you really love coffee, right? Feeling here is at the level of before you love the coffee, you take a sip and you go, oh, I like that. That's pleasant. That's nice. And then because you go, oh, that's pleasant and nice, I like that. Then you go, I really love this coffee. And you have an emotional reaction. I've got to have my coffee in the morning, right? I remember last week, I tasted it. It was so great. It was so enjoyable. I have to have it. So the emotional component comes a little bit later. First, you have a sensory perception. There's the coffee. I tried it. Oh, the flavor, delicious, pleasant, enjoyable, right? Next, you have discrimination, discernment. So this is basically the fact that your mind divides up sort of what is before it's divided up, one sort of, for lack of a better term, kind of smooth reality, right? You look out at your visual field, there are a bunch of colors and shapes. There's a sort of a white blocky blob thing here in the center, and the mind goes coffee cup. And when you pick it up, you look inside, there's this liquidy warm stuff in it, and you go coffee. And you try a sip and you go, oh, that's not coffee, that's tea, right? Or whatever. So the mind divides things up in reality, and it gives them names, and it ascribes meaning and value to those names and those divisions that it's created. Samskara. So this is really important concept in Buddhism, obviously. So intentional mental acts are included in this, and the imprints formed by those acts. In Mahayana texts like the Heart Sutra, basically this is replaced by what's called compositional factors. I apologize for my typos. So what's included here? Basically, this is the final grab bag of everything else. If you're using the Mahayana version, a compositional factor is every other type of mental activity, right? So in the Mahayana model, we've divided out feeling and sensory sensation, and we've divided out discernment, because feeling is mainly how ordinary beings live their lives. They like stuff, they don't like other things, they find some sensations pleasant and other ones repulsive and unwanted, and they just chase these their whole lives, and eventually they fly off, not having done much but chase their own wants and not wants, right? And this is what, even as religious people, we do all the time. However, supposedly, as religious people, we're also developing discernment or discrimination to start looking at reality, dividing it up, looking at the categories, yada, 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 and starting to change the way that we interact with our own experience. How do we change the way that we interact with our own experience? Well, if you believe in past lifetimes, if you think that that is a viable model for how things are, you're born into this life with a whole grab bag of impulses, instincts, sort of pre-programmed ways of relating to things that occur. So, for instance, I have 2 little nephews, and one of them, when he was learning to not even tie his shoes, but just strap his own shoes as a toddler, if you sat there and you said, you can do it, just take the little strappy thing on this side, all you do is you go like this, he would get pissed. He would lose his mind and start screaming. And the other one, he would go, oh, and he would do it without getting frustrated, without getting angry. So we have these impulses, instincts, emotional habits, and ways of reacting that we've inherited that we have from birth. Buddhism says these don't come from nowhere, and they don't come basically from your genetics. They come from past lives, right? Or we could even say a bit more sophisticated way, if you have a certain type of genetics that predisposes you to certain types of emotional habits that are so intense that they are ingrained at the physical level, that you cannot get away from certain habits because your physical body literally doesn't function properly. Well, this is even further evidence that you have an extremely strong package of that particular type of delusion, that particular type of negative emotion that you're bringing with you as part of the rebirth package and luggage that you carried with you into this life. Finally, there is vijnana, right? Consciousness itself. Consciousness itself is, in this context, includes things like the sensory awarenesses and so on. Those are also included in the previous way of describing it, although I was more so at that level talking about sort of consciousness in isolation from those other senses. But of course, knowingness pervades the eye, not the eye, but the mind that is involved with the visual consciousness is knowing visual forms. The minds that are associated with the ear organ are knowing sounds, and so on and so on. So this fact of a knowing factor that is involved with the sensory organs and the mental organ is, from a Buddhist perspective, sort of the consciousness, the mind itself, for lack of a better term. Also, within the 12 links model, for those who are familiar, the 12 links of rebirth and interdependence, the mind sometimes, I've read in some sources, includes basically your whole load of karma. But I find that explanation puzzling, because really your karma seems to be covered quite intensively here at the level of samskara. But in any case, that is a 20-minute or so explanation of consciousness. And if anyone's interested, we can go much, much deeper on this in another video, or if you'd like to chat with me privately, we can do that on a one-on-one basis. As I said, I have quite extensive notes justifying the position that mind is non-physical. So the last thing that we'll do is we will talk about the definition of meditation. And there's a lot of details here. I'm going to go in on the next video. I don't want to go into everything here. I just want to get into the definition itself. So if you read Je Tsongkhapa, if you read all of his commentators up to the modern time that are at least available in English, and I haven't read them all, but I've read quite a few, probably almost all of them that are available in English, you will be able to extract this definition. This definition is also based upon the notes and definition provided to me by my mentor, Kimball Whitfield, although I have edited it quite significantly based upon numerous other sources. So the basic definition of meditation, of actually gaining the first access level of full-blown samadhi, according to this Indian tradition, coming into Tibet, being commented on by these great Tibetan yogis and scholars, is this. It is a state of mental and physical pliancy arising from a highly sturdy, highly lucid, unbiased, and skillful state of mind which can hold attention uninterrupted on beneficial objects for as long as it wishes, while cognizing without conceptually adding or subtracting properties from its objects. Quite a mouthful. On the next video, I'm going to go through quite a bit more of the justifications for each piece of this definition and the explanations for each piece. But today, let me just go over a couple of key details in brief that are quite difficult for Westerners. Let's start with the tough things. Yeah? So I don't want to go over 90 minutes today. I'm going to keep the video at 90 minutes. So where does that take us? Oh, I've got about 8 minutes, but I was 10 minutes late. So I think I have about 18 minutes. In that case, I may have time to do the whole explanation. Let's see how far I get. So first things first, there is an extensive debate that we can have as to whether meditation is about training a skill or whether meditation is about revealing the natural state of mind. And we can have that debate, we can have that discussion. I will have it at some point on this channel. That being said, to me, it's somewhat of a false dichotomy. It's a bit of a false dichotomy. For the purposes of this level of the discussion, it's entirely suitable to think about calm abiding or to think about meditation as being a skill that you train in. And it's a skill that you now have this extremely sharp tool in your mental arsenal to be able to use to tackle certain issues and problems in terms of mental training, right? The rest of your mental training. And that's just fine for this level of the discussion. It's a trained skill because you don't have this capability today. You're going to have to train to get this capability. So it's skillful. It's a skillful state of mind. It's knowing because it cognizes or familiarizes with psychologically beneficial states and beneficial focal objects. So it's not simply some kind of thoughtless, blanked out state of mind, or you're like sitting there contemplating your navel. This is a state of mind that is cognizant at a much higher level of intensity than your ordinary state of mind. You are not asleep on your cushion. In particular, if you just started doing this, you should be sweating on your cushion from the effort of trying to keep your mind engaged in what you intended to do. That's not an exaggeration. You should be sweating for the first year or two just trying to keep your focus on your selected object or activity. Calm abiding or shamatha or samadhi is also observing an object without conceptually adding or subtracting qualities. Now, this is an extremely important point. It goes back to what we were talking about in terms of mind. Mind is luminous. Mind is in the business of creating qualities and adding qualities and taking qualities away. So cultivating a mind that can merely observe an object without adding a bunch of extra conceptual layers to what's going on with that object, without, as we were talking about a moment ago, without using that faculty of discernment and naming, is extremely demanding, especially in the beginning. We could spend quite a bit more time talking about what happens if you peel back layers of conception, but for today, we won't do that. In brief, one does hear quite a bit, though, about things like non-duality, becoming one with the object of meditation. This is the meaning, to a degree, of the term yoga, right? Union. So what's going on there? This, I think, is maybe one of the most difficult points for Westerners because it sounds quite mystical and strange if you're being honest with yourself about this material, right? But it's not, actually. Mind is in the business of carving up reality, carving up experience. And one of the things that it does is, as we said, it generates image, right? It encounters objects, material objects, and it generates interior mental images of those objects, and then it experiences those as an external environment. So what happens when you get rid of the conceptual activity that is dividing all that up into categories, including the category of self and not self? Well, then it appears that mind is inseparable with the objects that it generates, because it is. It's not mystical. And We have unbelievable research on this stuff now. There's something called the default mode network in psychology. Basically, it is your sense of being a person in the world, living the life that you're living. It includes envisioning future scenarios, autobiographical memory, i.e. thinking of the past and imagining this is the type of person that I am. So it's sort of like your internal psychological self-image. Moral decision-making, self-referential processing, right? So anytime you're processing something related to, well, this is me in the world doing something, right? All of that stops at high levels of concentration. So once again, this isn't mystical. You're just stopping the part of mind that generates all this extra conceptual stuff. And so the object appears to be non-different with the mind, because in reality, it is non-different with the mind. Right? It's not rocket science, actually. Maybe better than rocket science. So the other quite difficult point is Shintu Jangwa. And for the Tibetan speakers in the room, I apologize for my horrific pronunciation, as I don't speak Tibetan. So mental and physical pliancy, what is that? Well, it is the final demarcation of having attained calm abiding meditation. First of all, if you don't have mental and physical pliancy, you don't have shamatha, samadhi, calm abiding. From the perspective of this system, you haven't done it yet. You're still working on it. So this term has been translated in a lot of different ways. You can translate it suppleness, agility, flexibility, serviceability. I like serviceability a lot because I think it gets at the real core of the issue. You've created a mental and physical condition that is now workable, can be used as an instrument to do whatever you need it to do. Which goes to something my mentor used to say all the time, which is, what about this activity makes you think that like after a couple of years of doing this, that you're going to be completely dysfunctional in the world? Why is it that you think something about this activity is going to make you less sharp, less capable, less exacting in your discernment of what's going on in terms of conventional stuff? Your mind should be sharper. It should be more capable. The conceptual constructs you create should be more accurate because now you can see them with high granularity. I digress. So, serviceability. What is this serviceability that arises in the mind and the body? Well, first of all, it's developed through extended training in meditation. Basically, the Olympic athletes of this kind of training are those who have spent 10,000 to 40,000 hours doing this training exclusively, or as a significant component of other types of training that involve this state of mind. So this does take some work. That being said, we will circle back around and say that you can do that work in the world without leaving it. But at this point in time, it's important to realize that even in the world, you have to do the work. You can't get away from the work. So very important details here. Basically, what physical and mental pliancy or serviceability gives you is the ability to sit in meditation unbrokenly, uninterruptedly, undistractedly, without getting tired, without getting hungry, without getting thirsty, without needing to take a nap, for as long as you'd like, without the body getting uncomfortable or tired, without the mind getting uncomfortable or tired. You can rest in concentration for as long as you need to accomplish whatever it is you're doing. If that takes an hour, you can do that perfectly and unbrokenly. If it takes a week, that's fine. If it takes 2 months, that's also fine. Now, I think as Westerners, this is an extremely difficult point, although it's funny, when I talk to my Tibetan teachers and when you talk to some Thai forest tradition practitioners, and you talk to some Zen practitioners, anyone who's been around a great meditator who has this capability will tell you that from time to time, these great beings, they go into meditation and they can sit for a week or 2 weeks or a month without moving. So to a degree, we don't need the science to tell us that this is possible. It's possible. The scientists don't know how it's possible, but there are people doing this. And there are Western educated people with master's degrees and doctorates who have seen people do this. So you don't really have to take it on faith that this is a thing. This is something that occurs in the real world that people are doing today. Human beings just like you. For those who are a bit more skeptical, like myself, having even been around a long while, there's a great deal of science on this now. So for those who are interested, I can share these academic articles, but these are reputable articles published in reputable places. Good journals, good scientists, and really good participants for their studies. So just as an example, an advanced Tibetan meditator can slow their metabolism 64% at will. So thinking about that, a normal person whose metabolism is running at a relatively normal pace should die after about 10 days. Now, if at the drop of a hat, one of these meditators can lower their metabolism by 64%, then physiologically, we should be able to posit that they could spend at least 20 days, right? If not 25 days in unbroken activity, where the body's not moving, the mind is barely moving, right? So there's not much need for extra nutrition, or there's not much going on in terms of exertion, right? And that's really at will. Some meditators, even today, will tell you that, they can literally stop, they can get the breath to a level that's so subtle that it is as if they have stopped breathing. Their breathing is so slow that if you were looking from the outside, you'd think they weren't breathing at all. And some of them will say you actually stop breathing entirely at certain levels of concentration. So from the outside, you would look dead to other people. You'd be sitting there not breathing with your heart pumping so slowly that they couldn't tell that you were alive. So these are, again, things that we have some anecdotal evidence for from people who hang around meditators, and we have some science for. The next question then is, well, okay, fine. Let's say that we accept that you could physically do it, but what about mentally? You get tired, you get sleepy, and so then you're just sitting there sleeping, right? Well, no. There have been great studies on flow in the West, and basically, if you get into a concentrated state, even as a normal person, it reduces fatigue, it reduces tiredness physically and mentally. So extrapolating that, we're talking about generating perfect concentration. So you should have extraordinary mental and physical sort of capability to carry on with the activity. Interestingly, there's been some research in the last decade, a little over a decade, also showing that there is an inverse relationship between those who basically can do high-level concentrated meditations and how much they need to sleep. Anecdotally, we've heard this a lot. If you've been around, you'll hear meditators say this, that, oh, if you get better at meditation, you don't need to sleep as much, and that's just how it is. But there's science on this now. It has been shown that not only do you not need to sleep as much, but you don't get insomnia from not sleeping as much. So now let's extrapolate these results. When you train in concentration, even as a normal person in normal activities, living in the midst of the world, you should have less mental and physical fatigue. You should have less insomnia, correlating with the amount of concentration that you can generate, and you should be able to lower your metabolism dramatically. Well, doesn't this now make it conceivable from a scientific perspective that somebody could, with sufficient training, sit for 30 days without need for rest, without need for food or water, or that maybe even 60 days, maybe even longer. This now becomes a real scientific possibility, and it goes beyond simply being attested to by reliable modern Buddhists who have seen meditators do this in modern times. So that is the final component that we'll discuss today. If you have gained mental and physical pliancy, then you have gained the first level of concentration, the first level of real meditative capability. Everything up until that point is the training to gain mental and physical pliancy, right? So it's not meditation yet. Everything you do to get there is not meditation. Like a fitness class is not fitness. You don't go to the class once and then say, yeah, I'm fit now. Fitness is something that happens after like 6 months or a year or 2 years of training really hard, and your body is fit, right? It's a result. So being fit is the result of having done a lot of athletic training. In the exact same way, having this type of meditative capability to generate mental and physical pliancy at will and being able to remain in a mental state of concentration at will for as long as you'd like is a highly, highly trained capability and skill. It's called combining shine, shamatha, samadhi, right? And in brief, that is it for today. So just to recap in the last 2 minutes, and then we'll call it a day. On non-sectarianism, there is a great deal really to be said that I didn't say today. I'd like to say a lot more, but in brief, there's just so much in common. You know, there should be so much more camaraderie amongst the meditative traditions because we share so much in common. And really, we're struggling to generate the same types of internal states at the basic level. In terms of mind, in terms of consciousness, we discussed clarity, luminosity, and knowing, which are the fundamental aspects of mind according to Buddhism. And then we just very briefly discussed, well, what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about meditation in Buddhism? And these are the core elements of the description. Mental and physical pliancy arising from a mind that's highly sturdy, highly stable, highly awake and lucid, right? Unbiased. A mind that is skilled in that it's not just something that you innately have. You have to develop this capability. In particular, it's skilled at holding its attention uninterrupted on objects that are beneficial for extended periods of time, as it wishes, as long as needed, without adding or subtracting properties from those objects. So these are the quintessential properties of this capability from the perspective of Je Tsongkhapa's tradition as it comes through the Venerable Kamalashila and numerous other sources, as also filtered through the teachings of my teacher and some of my own thoughts in terms of pulling together elements that are kind of spread out amongst these commentators into putting them in one place. So thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Modern Western Buddhism, and I really, really hope to be seeing you again soon. I'd like to get some people in the chat and do sort of after hours question and answer when people are interested, and please do reach out to me if you'd like to get access to the actual notes, because they're much more extensive than the ramblings that I just carry on with here on video. And then finally, if you think that this information is useful and helpful, I do have a Patreon, and your contributions there, some of them will go towards a charitable cause, and most likely FBMT, but also a lot of the donations that I receive will go towards supporting my own practice and my ongoing PhD research related to Tibetan Buddhism, which I hope will be of some benefit to others as well. So once again, thank you so much. And I hope to be seeing you all again very soon. Thank you for joining me.